Welcome to the In Between podcast,
a space for real conversations and meaningful interviews about life, faith, culture, leadership,
and everything in between.
We've got a great episode for you today. I sat down with Jennifer Farmer to talk about Black History Month, in particular, some pretty deep and insightful and sometimes heavy topics. Among them is a whole conversation we had around Tyree Nichols, and he was recently killed at the hands of police in Memphis, and so what we're talking about in this episode is the triumphs of Black history, but also the tragedies. Really talking about pain and how to process pain and grief, and how is it we as people of faith can come together to respond and to hold each other up through really painful situations. So Jennifer, she's an author, entrepreneur, and she's a public relations expert. She runs Spotlight PR, which is a boutique public relations firm that supports social and racial justice leaders and campaigns. And so she's got a tremendous amount of experience in this area. She's also a Christian woman. She's a member of Vineyard Columbus, and she's also an author of First and Only, a Black woman's guide to thriving at work and in life. So enjoy this episode. Welcome, Jennifer. It's so good to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So you're a part of Vineyard Columbus, and it's wonderful to have you join us, and so grateful that you're taking the time. And I'd love to hear a little bit of your faith story. You grew up and you were in a family of believers. You heard the Bible, and I'd love to hear what it was like as a person growing up in a Christian home.
So my mother was an evangelist, and she was always taking us to different churches around Columbus and in Dayton. And she had a close friend. Her name was Pastor Hines, and she pastored a church in Dayton, Ohio, Huber Heights, actually. And sometimes she would come to Columbus and she would stay with us. And I always liked when Pastor Hines came because, we would wake up and hear her praying. She would go through our house praying.
Wow.
And she was a phenomenal cook. And so we knew that we were going to eat good food.
You got the best of everything.
Yeah, we were going to eat good food, and we were going to hear a lot about God. And, there was something that was very comforting about knowing that our mother was praying and that she was leaning in, and that a lot of her friends were ministers or they were in the church. So there was something very comforting.
Yeah.
And, my mother walked closely with the Lord. At different points throughout my life, I'd be doing things and I would run into people and they would say, "I think I know your mom." I'm like, "No, you don't know my mom." They were like, "No, I met her at the doctor's office." So
she talked to everyone.
She talked to everybody.
She evangelized everywhere she went.
She didn't meet strangers. She would say, "Hey, can I tell you something? Jesus loves you."
Oh.
And
That's
so,
great.
so that was amazing. And I don't know that I fully appreciated that until my mother passed. My mother passed in 2021. And when she died, I was thinking, this is an incredible legacy, and am I able to hold this?
Yeah.
And am I able to lean into prayer? When I was in college, sometimes if my friends were going through something traumatic, I would call my mom and I would ask her to pray for them.
Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, I'm a parent. Has my son ever called me because his friends were in crisis and I prayed for them? And so there was just, there was a lot there. My parents, they divorced when I was very young, but my father's family, they were also heavily in the church. And one of the things that I loved and that I still remember vividly is my dad and my uncles sitting around a kitchen table at my grandmother's house talking about the Bible. And they talked about the characters in the Bible as though they knew them,
That's cool.
And so that was always very exciting. And it wasn't like a conversation between just like two friends. They were passionate and they were not quite arguing, but their voices were raised, and they clearly cared about the Bible and breaking it down and understanding it. So that was that also shaped my life.
It's so deeply formative, right? And being in those kind of environments, it's not just the sound of prayers, but it's the smell of the food. It's the watching, how your family's interacting and how natural it is for them to talk about faith. And all of that like deeply forms you and you don't realize it.
And you don't realize
right?
it. I remember a guy wanted to take me on a date. And my mother said, "Oh, absolutely. You can take her. There's a revival and you can pick her and you can pick all of us up and take us to the revival." And I thought, okay, one, I was horrified that she said that. And then when the guy showed up, like she was serious. And so we went to church. We went to a revival and I thought, okay, this guy will never call me again. And I don't think he called me again. But my mother, she was unwavering and she was not going to compromise.
Yeah. That's amazing. We say in Christianity that our faith has no grandchildren. They're children.
Interesting.
That similar to what you described with your mother, like there's a point where you have to make this yours. You have to become a child of this faith. And there was a season where that wasn't true for you, I think, right? And that's very true for a lot of young adults. You kind of grow up and you find you're going a different way, or you're going your own way, or you haven't incorporated some of the things as you described in the way.
Yeah.
How is your coming back to that? You described your mom passing away and that being a realization. What was that like?
So I lived in the DC area for close to a decade. And when I left Columbus, I was coming to Vineyard and then I went to DC. And I remember one of my thoughts was, will I find a good church? Will I find a good small group? And my work has been in social justice and racial justice. And so there came a time where I was preoccupied with work and where I would tell myself, I'm doing good work. I'm doing God's work. God understands. If I'm not at church every Sunday, God understands. I'm traveling here and there. I'm meeting with good people. I'm supporting them. And, one thing about sin is you never stay where you start. And it just expands and it snowballs. And so before you knew it, I wasn't even thinking about the fact that I wasn't going to church.
Yeah.
I wasn't even thinking about the fact that that I wasn't in deep community with believers. I was just living my life. And, I got to a point where I thought all was going well. And although I experienced different traumatic situations that would make me think about God, I still, it was short-lived. And so I came to a point where, like I said, there was a lot going well. I was making more money than I had ever made. I was traveling the world. I had a deep not the world, but the United States. I had a deep Rolodex, and people would call on me and I would get projects. And I ended up getting pregnant for the second time. And as I was going through the pregnancy, it was very difficult. But the turning point for me was when I went to the hospital to give birth to my daughter. And my family was here in Columbus. By this point, my mother was very sick, so she could not be there. I had a girlfriend who she and I had been friends for very long. And when I told her I was in labor, she got in the car. She left her husband and her family. She got in the car from Columbus and she drove to Virginia to be with me.
Wow.
But when I'm in the hospital, I'm sitting on the side of the bed and I was asking myself, how did I end up here again? I have an older son, but I thought that I had grown so much. And so I was asking myself how. And then I was walking through in my head, not just how did I end up here, but how am I going to make it? I have responsibilities to my son. I live in an area that the cost of living is just insane.
Yeah.
I have a job that's demanding, that I don't sit still. I'm traveling a lot. And so I sat on the side of the bed and I repented. And when I say repented, I told God, God, if you give me another chance, I will live the second half of my life different from how I lived the other life.
Wow.
If you give me another chance, I will make you my focus, not my career, not dating, not things that seem like they're fun. I will make you my focus. And I remember my aunt called me. She was in Columbus and, I just cried and I just told her how I felt. And when I left the hospital, I believe that, of course, God heard me. He heard me when I cried.
Yeah.
He heard me when I was talking to him. But when I left the hospital, I began to walk that thing out, and I had visited a church that I liked and I re-engaged in the church. And I found them, it was the Macedonia Baptist Church, to be very welcoming and to be very loving, you know? And so they were always excited to see me. There were always arms who would grab my baby. There were always people who were just ready to help in whatever way. And this was in 2017. And since that time, I have tried to honor that commitment. And, you know, Eric, if I could tell you how my life is now, if you would have told me at that point, Jennifer, this is what's going to happen, I would have said, you need to stop lying. I would have said, there's no way. But what God has done in my life in 6 years, it's something that he has made it up, you know, and it's something that I could not have even, it's better than I could even imagine. It doesn't mean that my life is problem-free, but the ways that God has shown up for me, the ways that he has given me uncommon favor, it's just, it's remarkable. And so that was like my turning back.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what a story that I think, you know, many of our listeners can identify with, right? Where there is such a different experience after you have this moment and make this commitment and see, like, what is it like when God is actually leading my life and not me, with all the weight and responsibility as well, right? Not that there's not weight and responsibility, but it's completely different, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. You
know, you had mentioned that, you know, so much of your work and focus is on social justice and racial justice, and this is Black History Month. And, you know, so often, you know, so much of the conversation that I hear around Black History Month is on sort of the positive advancements, you know, for the Black community, and, you know, and that's right and good. But you had emailed me recently because you had just seen the video. It was Friday evening, and you'd seen the video of Tyree Nichols, who had just been murdered at the hands of police. And you said, you know, are we as a faith community going to do anything? You know, how can we process this grief? And it really struck me that, you know, so much of what, you know, the Black community and what you were expressing to me in that moment was Black History Month is also about acknowledging pain, walking through grief, learning how to do that in ways that help you move forward and for us to become better. And you've written and thought a lot about collective grief. And I wonder if you could kind of unpack that for us. Like, what was your experience, and what is a collective grieving process? How does that look, and how might that be helpful for our listeners as you're processing that?
Sure. So the first thing that I'll say is I didn't watch the Tyree Nichols video.
Yeah.
I work with grassroots groups across the country who work on a variety of issues, including police reform. And so whenever there is, not whenever, but oftentimes when there is a fatal police shooting, chances are I have a client who is working on that, who's organizing. In this case, I have a client in Memphis, Tennessee. And so I've been here so many times before where, you know, you're, you know, with Tyree Nichols, as I read about what happened to him, I could not wrap my head around how one human being can do that to another human being. And then I was also sitting with, for my client who's in Memphis, like, what must she be going through? What does she need? What does the community need?
Yeah.
And oftentimes when there are fatal police shootings, it's not just, it doesn't just impact the family, but it impacts other people as well, you know? And so if you have had any kind of contact with law enforcement, it could be, and it wasn't positive, it could be triggering. It could take you back.
Yes.
But then you could also be enveloped into this fear of what will happen if I have, you know, will this happen to me? Will this happen to someone who I love? And I'll tell you, when George Floyd, you know, another Black man who was killed by police, when he died, I remember sinking into somewhat of a depression. And as I was thinking through that and I was grieving, I had a few white friends who reached out. And one woman said, I just want you to know that I see you. That's all she said. And then I had another friend who said, I don't know what to say, but I'm thinking of you and I'm praying for you. And then it's almost like in rapid succession, different people just started reaching out. And in that moment, what that told me is that God sees me. It told me that we don't always have to know exactly what to say, that we can have a ministry of presence of just saying, you know, I'm going to walk with you, or I just want you to know that you're not alone. I want you to know that you're loved. And that is very, very instrumental as, you know, as people, as different communities are processing grief and trying to make sense of why this happens and why it continues to happen and that kind of thing.
It's really helpful. And I appreciate you sharing too that you didn't watch the video. I know that, you know, it's just far too painful and overwhelming for so many.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that you wrote about right after the news started coming out about Tyree Nichols, you wrote an article in Religion News Service about not just Tyree, but his mother. Just hours after her son died, she had to get in front of the public, right?
Yes.
In front of cameras.
Yes.
And you just reflected on what that might be like and the injustice of that.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, you know, one of the things that stunned me about the story is, you know, whatever channel you turned the television on, you saw her Tyree's mother. And I mean, talking about her son's death right after he died, right? And I just thought, how is that possible? How is it possible? But then my mind went to how often does this happen? You know, and I started thinking about what feels like it's the norm. And I say this to you while also acknowledging the incredible role that the media can play in amplifying a story, in ensuring that it's not that people know about it. So I understand the role of media, but I also thought I don't want to see this. You know, I'm tired of seeing parents. I'm tired of seeing mothers. I'm tired of seeing fathers. As soon as their loved one dies, they're on TV talking about it.
Right.
And I thought about when my mom died, and although she didn't die violently, it was so difficult to just do ordinary tasks, you know, like getting up and making breakfast or cleaning your house. Or I remember when I went to the funeral home to view the body, I nearly passed out, you know, and so in that moment, in what was a very low moment, I could not have imagined having a camera in front of me. I could not imagine having a microphone. I needed to process what had happened. And so I just thought, I understand the necessity of wanting to talk about your loved one, but is that really healthy? You know, it's like, don't we need time to process in private? Before we process publicly?
That's right.
And how often is this happening? So that's kind of that's what I was thinking, and that's where I was coming from.
What an awful experience. I wonder if you could share a little bit about, you know, reflecting on grief, which you've written a lot about. You know, we sometimes think about the stages of grief and, you know, all of the different emotions and you know, experiences as we walk through grief in our lives. And as you think about grief as a Black woman watching this with, you know, very often young Black men, how have you noticed your own grief process? Because it's not just like one experience, right? Where it's like, it's like, okay, here we are again and again and again. And I just wonder if you've reflected on that, the impact of that.
Yeah. I mean, you know, one of the things that I think about is how often are we in this position, and the importance of expanding our concept of grief. You know, there was a time that people thought of grief as only when a loved one dies.
Yes.
And if you know the loved one, or if you're friends, you know, then you're directly impacted. But I actually think that each time there's like a fatal police shooting or something traumatic, a mass shooting, the United States has so much gun violence, a mass shooting. I feel like that does something to all of us,
Yes.
right? And when I write from my social location because I only know what it's like to walk in my shoes.
Yeah.
And so my social location is as a mother, as a Black woman, as a Christian woman, as someone raised in the Midwest. And so I think about, when I start writing, I think about where I am and people like me. And then there's so many statistics about health disparities. There's so many statistics about, even single mothers. I'm a single mother. And so what I think about is how often is this demographic placed in this position? And then what do they need? I feel like, I mentioned earlier expanding our understanding of grief. And I feel like whenever there is a traumatic event, we have to grieve that. And the grieving, it can't just be, I don't know that it can always play out publicly, but it also can't just be that person. It's a community process. And I think when there are traumatic things that happen, people look to people of faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's so many competing messages online. And so when something traumatic happens, I think, okay, well, what does God say about this?
Yeah.
How does God feel? And then I look to faith leaders. Okay, so what does this? I remember I used to work with Bishop William Barber, and I was working with him around the time of the Mother Emanuel shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. And I called him. And I said, at this point, he was Reverend Barber. And I said, you have to say something. And I said, people, they need hope. They're struggling. You have to say something. How do you feel? And so that's kind of where I start is, okay, what does God say about this? What are faith leaders saying? And the reason I think about faith leaders is because it's a source that we should be able to trust.
That's so helpful. I want to unpack a couple of things you just said. One of them, you talked about the role of faith.
Yeah.
And, as you think about this particular experience or any number of these fatal shootings, what is the role of faith, maybe even, over the last, as you mentioned, 6 or 7 years, since you've really, shifted your own mindset toward the Lord in a significant way? I think about, the Apostle Paul says, we don't want you to grieve like other people who have no hope.
Right.
And I can imagine that, so many of us are watching situations like this and it feels hopeless.
Yes.
And how is it that your Christian faith might allow you to grieve differently?
My Christian faith prevents me from going into a hole, prevents me from feeling like all hope is lost. And when you get to the point where you feel like all hope is lost, you're no longer willing to try.
Yeah.
And my Christian faith says, no, this happened, but, God is bigger.
Yeah.
And my Christian faith helps me to remember that there are good people in the world. And as bad as we think the world is now, and it is terrible, what would this world be like if it weren't for Christians? What kind of situation would we be in if all of God's people were removed?
Wow.
And so my faith says you have to find a way to hold on, and you have to turn the focus back to me. And one of the things that I think about is, okay, God, what does it look like to fight for justice, but to still have a heart that's open and that's yielded to you? What does it look like to fight for justice and to hear things that are not right and to be able to distinguish between the right and the wrong, even, in a bad situation?
Yeah.
And, that the scripture that you shared about grieving, we are not to grieve as the world grieves. It was so instrumental to me when my mother died, because I know that my mother lived her life for God. I know that she's resting in his arms. And I know that if I live the way that she lived, I will see her again. And so even, sometimes I think about her and I'm like, man, I wish she could see this. But I'm like, you know what? I will see her again.
Yeah.
And so it's that hope piece. And I think that is what is needed. And that's what I try try to lean into.
Yeah, that's so insightful. I'd love to touch on something else you'd mentioned, which is the role of faith leaders in the church.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that we as, pastors struggle with as we, watch over the last few years, especially so much unrest and violence around race, is how do we respond in a way that doesn't just feel performative, right? Like we just look around and it's like, we tweet something out and it feels like, just a slacktivist and, I'm just, words are meaningless here. Like, what are words going to do? And then, when it comes to the Black community as white pastors for Julie and I, it's like, gosh, how do we even say anything that is going to be meaningful, as white folks? And so how is it, as there are pastors listening and faith leaders listening to this podcast, when things like this occur and our whole nation is caught up in it, what are ways that we can respond that really are meaningful and helpful and, that bring healing and not just, whatever, that was nice, it sounds like a politician and who cares?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's something weighty to wrestle with. Mm-hmm. There's two things that I want to say, something about Demar Hamlin, and then I don't want to lose it. That's why I'm telling you. So let me start with Demar Hamlin first. Actually, I'll start someplace else. I think that at our core, each of us wants to be seen. We want to be seen. Yeah. I have a couple clients and they really see me. And one of my clients, she will say, I see you. And she may not know my exact experience, but the fact that she's willing to try to see me, the fact that she names that, that's enough for me. And so I think that even when we, there are barriers based on culture, to the extent that we can work to see one another, I think that is doing a tremendous, I think that counts for something. It's meaningful. In 2022, in January of 2022, I got a call in the middle of the night and it was my work phone. I thought, who's calling me at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night? And I only answered it because I could not sleep and I just thought, who is it? So I answered the call and it was a Muslim leader who I knew, but I had never worked with him. And he said, Jennifer, there is a rabbi who was held hostage. He and his congregants just got out and they need crisis communications help. Can you help them? Wow. And I said, yes. And at midnight, I was talking to the president of the synagogue, and I was talking to their legal counsel. And by 12:30 a.m., we had, I was their publicist.
I remember that.
And when that happened, at first I said, God, I'm a Black woman. I don't even live in Texas. I'm not Jewish. How am I going to represent him? Yeah. But then I thought, okay, well, he just went through something traumatic. He needs someone who knows and who understands how the media works. And so I said, okay, I don't know all the formalities and I may get some of this wrong, but I had to be willing to get some of it wrong. And so I worked with the rabbi and he and his wife, and they invited me over. I ended up flying to Dallas. I sent someone the first week. Then the next week I flew to Dallas and they invited me over for Shabbat dinner. And then they invited me over for a couple services. And I was going through the services and I was doing my best to follow along and also feeling a little bit out of place.
Oh, yeah.
But when I saw the congregants weep about what their rabbi had been through, and when I saw how they felt about the ongoing attacks, I said, I can relate to that. I may not have everything right, but I can relate to that. And I tried in that moment, and over the course of the time that I was working with him and the congregation, I tried to see them. And I think that's what Black people want. I think that's what white people want. I think that's what young people want. We want to be seen.
So good.
Even if we don't, and I know there were some things that I did not get right, but my heart was in the right place and I tried. And so there's something about that. The other thing that I think the church can do is to pray. And I mean, really pray.
Yeah.
I think about Demar Hamlin when his heart stopped on the field.
Yes.
And I watched the way that Buffalo Bills fans prayed. I watched the way that the people in Cincinnati prayed. I even saw a television commentator who prayed on air.
Yeah, wow.
He prayed on air. And when I saw the way that people were praying, I said, that man is going to live. And he's going to live because people are praying.
Wow.
And when I think about my prayer life, you talked about prayer on Sunday, I thought, I don't always lean in, but I wonder what would happen if God's people really leaned into prayer. Not like, a quick,
right.
I'm on my way. Okay,
Yeah.
God, I need you to do this, but really leaned into prayer
Intercede.
and worship and
That's right.
and to intercede.
Yeah.
And I just feel like we're not doing that to the extent that we could. We don't need all the answers, but if we really, really leaned into prayer, I believe that God would show us at different points what to do,
Wow.
who to call. And so those are the two things that I feel like the faith community could do more of.
Such a good word. I was there at that game.
Were you really?
And it was eerie. It was the way the whole stadium of, I don't know what, 70,000 people, a hush, and many people praying, and just, I mean, you could hear somebody, yelled across the stadium. It was so quiet, and I love the way you just call us to, because in prayer there is a discernment.
Yeah.
Where we hear from the Lord, like, what does the Lord want?
Yeah.
And it does take time.
Yeah.
To pause, and it's hard in those moments to pause, because there's so much maybe grief or anxiety or pressure, feeling like we've got to do something.
Absolutely.
And so you want to move and
Absolutely.
go into action, when what the moment calls for is to slow down, to pause, to take a moment.
Yeah.
And that's really insightful. One of the things, just thinking too about this experience with the synagogue and you working with them, we know, and you being, an expert in communications, you're seeing this everywhere, is the nature of our conversations have been really stilted, and in so many ways halted. You look at surveys, around not just race, but politics or COVID or anything, right? And what people are saying on the left and the right, politically, white and black, or all kinds of, races that we're coming from, we're afraid to speak because we're afraid of being shut down.
Yeah.
Or afraid of saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Or, saying something that's racist or sexist or what have you.
Yeah.
Making mistakes.
Right.
Sinning.
Right.
And, I think the tragedy of that, of course, is that it's only in community like this, right? Like, I'm listening to you and I'm growing.
Yeah.
I'm learning.
And likewise.
And I'm sure I'm going to look back and be like, why did I say it that way? And I'm very careful to write it out, and, but you don't read it, you say it, and you make mistakes.
Right.
And we're losing that, though, as a culture.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could reflect on that, and maybe the role of grace, or, how is it that we might, as white people, as black people, as Asians, as, come into a space where we're learners, like you described.
Yeah.
Where it's okay to kind of learn and grow, and also stumble and fall.
That's such an interesting question, because I've said for years, when you work in social justice, there's a whole vernacular.
Yes.
And there's things that, people in the space say that if you have no clue.
Right.
It's like a whole nother language. You can translate it. And I've noticed that if you say the wrong thing, people are like, nope, that's not it.
Yeah.
And then I feel like there's something about social media and the desire for attention, the desire for likes, that people will hear you say something, hear you make a mistake, but if they call it out, they'll be celebrated, they'll get more followers. And if they're nasty about it, then they will get more followers. And I don't know how we solve for that. I think that we should name it because it does make people very, very afraid. And then you watch what happens to others and you're like, okay, I don't want that to happen to me.
That's
I could
right.
lose everything. So I'm
Yes.
I'm not going to engage. I'm
Yeah.
not going to participate. And I'm not quite sure how we address it other than practicing grace with ourselves and then practicing grace with others and, and resisting. I heard a sermon years ago about refusing to take offense. And the pastor, he used to pastor the Potter's House on the West Side, Timothy Oldfield. But he preached a sermon about not taking offense and how easy it is to be offended, but choosing not to be a person who searches for offense. And I've thought about that sermon from time to time because sometimes I really think it is a matter of saying, okay, they said that, but is that what they meant? And just choosing not to be offended or choosing to struggle with someone. I have a friend, she and I have been friends for 20 something years. And we talk about the ways that we struggle with each other and the ways that we help each other grow. She's white. And our backgrounds are very, very similar. And there's a lot that she has learned from me, and there's a lot that I've learned from her. But it's only because we are committed to struggle with each other, and we're committed. I'll get upset with her; she'll get upset with me. But we know that as long as we are on this plane, we're going to be friends. So we're going to have to find a way to work it out. And I think that we need more of that.
We need way more of that.
Yeah.
I completely agree. And spaces where we can sit together.
Right.
And not just, with screens, on social media, but in conversation.
Right.
Sitting.
And I think about, the rabbi in the synagogue.
Yeah.
They, there was a lot that I did not know. And they made a decision that, no, we need her expertise and we're going to draw her in. And they could have just said,
that's right.
They could have just said no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we want, someone who's Jewish, who really knows us, who could really, we don't have to interpret anything or.
Right.
Yeah, that's.
And even now, Rabbi Charlie, he went to another synagogue and they had an installation service. I believe it's what it's called. And I wanted to go, but I got sick that weekend. And so he sent me something, basically praying that I would be well. And he translated it for me.
Wow, how cool.
And I just thought that was great.
Yeah, that is. I want to go back to Tyree Nichols. And,
yes.
One of the things in thinking about grief and in this particular situation, and I think for a lot of people who, in a lot of the national conversation out of this was, how could it be that 5 Black officers could do this to a Black man? And there's a lot of, I think, added to the grief, a lot of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Like this doesn't fit.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine for the Black community that was a different kind of wrestle than even the national conversation that was happening, on Fox News and CNN and, all of these other spaces. How do you process that?
Well, the way that I process it is, there was a significant time in America's history where, we went through slavery and then Jim Crow. Yeah. And so I think that you don't wake up and become anti-racist. And you can be Black and you can still be anti-Black. Yeah. You can be Black and still harbor ill feelings about Black people. Yeah. And just because you're Black, if you're not doing the work, it doesn't mean that you don't have bias. Yes. You have to, no matter who you are always doing work. Yeah. And so that's the first thing, is that you don't get a pass just because you're Black. You don't get a pass just because your people have experienced marginalization. Are you doing ongoing work? Your work may be different than mine, but I still have mine. I still have work to do. Yeah. And so that's the first thing that I think. The other thing that I think is the culture of policing in the United States, it has to be reformed. If the system of policing is changed, it doesn't matter the race of the officer that you put in the system. They're going to operate differently. Yeah. But if the system views Black people as less than or as more prone to crime, then no matter who's policing the community, this is how you're going to see this community, even if you all are both Black. And so when I think about, and I'm not an expert on policing, so I don't want to give that impression. But when I think about the Scorpion unit that was put together, I wonder, and when I learned that the officers were Black, I said, I wonder how they viewed the people that they were policing.
Yeah.
Did they view them as more prone to crime? Did they view them as less needing sympathy? You know, how did they view them? Because how they view them is going to determine how they engage with them.
Yeah.
And so that's just like how I wrap my head around it is, it's the system,
Yeah.
you know, and it's also like, you know, what were their, I'm very curious, how did they view that community? Did they see themselves as part of the community?
Yeah.
Or was there a wall between them and, you know, and the community?
Yes.
Because if you know your neighbor, you know, on the street that I live, I know most of my neighbors. And my neighbors, they know so much about me that if a car comes in our neighborhood, we have one neighbor who says that car doesn't belong. That's how well they pay attention.
Yeah.
If they saw my daughter playing, oh, that's Jennifer's baby. You know, where's your mother? And so, and that's just, that's the level we do things together.
Yeah.
We intentionally, like they drug me to a wreath making class. And I'm like, okay, this is what we're doing. And so what I wonder is the officers who were policing that community, did they see themselves as part of the community or did they see the people as an other?
Yeah.
And if they see them as an other, you can harm an other, but you can't harm someone who is an extension of you.
Yeah. That's so helpful. You know, you talk about, you know, showing up in ways to be change within, you know, our environments, to continue to do the work. You've written about leadership a lot. And I wonder what you would say to leaders, whether it's in, you know, the areas of policing or business or church, faith communities, about the kind of work that we need to be doing as leaders to create the kind of environments where we can invite people to the table in a way to be full participants that are respected and included and whose voices are important and valued. And that's not, of course, the history that we have in many organizations. And, you know, a lot of folks listening are maybe in organizations where they're sitting and looking and it's like, yeah, a lot of people here look like me. And so what does that work look like for leaders?
One of the things that I think leaders have to wrestle with is, what does it look like to share power? You know, what does it look like to ensure that there's a pipeline of people who are prepared, you know, who are equipped, who are trained? So what does that look like? And then the ego can tell you, oh no, Jennifer, it has to be you. You've had this experience. No one else can do it but
right.
you.
Yeah.
So I think it's also checking the ego. But I also think that leaders could inquire and could ask. You know, I learned so much when I asked different people, so what do you think? How do you see this?
Yeah.
And then just hearing from them, what do you think needs to change?
Being learners.
Yeah, and being in a constant state where you're willing to learn, where you're willing to ask questions.
As we close, I'd love to hear what you would have to say to our African American sisters and brothers this Black History Month. Maybe a word of encouragement that you might have.
The word of encouragement that I would have to our really to everyone is that, one, Black history is American history, so it's your history too. You know, I think about when there's a breakdown in a relationship, even if I cause the breakdown, let's say I cause a breakdown in our relationship, I'm still going to carry that with me. You know, until there's reconciliation, until there's healing, I'm going to carry some of it and you're going to carry some of it. Yeah. We're both going to carry some of it, although it may look different.
That's right.
And so the first thing that I would say is Black history is American history. Yeah. We all have a stake to it. And then I think I would end the way that I began, is that it's imperative for us to see what's happening, to do what we can from where we sit in the world, but then to maintain hope. Like we cannot get to the point where we lose hope. We have to maintain hope.
So good. Thank you, Jennifer. What a pleasure to sit with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this week's conversation. As you listen to this episode, what stood out to you the most? Let us know by emailing podcast@vineyardcolumbus.org, or if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. All the books mentioned in today's episode can be found in our online bookstore at vineyardbookstore.com. Have a great week.